welcome to episode 1 of Maturing Together podcast. My name is Dr. Tammy Oliori, and I'm your host of this podcast. If you're new here and you want to learn a little bit more about what this podcast is about, then please do check out the introductory episode where you would also find out a little bit more information about me. So let's get into the gist of today. Today, we are going to be looking at the link between low self worth and trauma. Or, as I like to put it, why can't we talk about disconnection from yourself without looking at trauma? Trauma is such a big word, and particularly one that society can be divided about, and one that carries a lot of myth around it. A lot of people think that trauma is just about big events like war, famine, sexual assaults, physical abuse, and so on and so forth. But really, we know that trauma isn't just about the event; is the event, and also subsequently what happens afterwards. So, trauma is an injury of powerlessness and helplessness when something huge happens to us and there are no resources, and our body has to go into extremities to cope with it, and the pain goes unresolved. It's not just a psychological injury, actually, it's also a physiological injury because it actually rewires our biology. So, people think that trauma is just about what happened, and for a lot of people, they think I should be over it because it's something that is in the past. Unfortunately, whilst the event may have happened in the past, it has rewired your biology, and we will talk a little bit more about that. So, let's come back to it. When people struggle with low self worth, which often is accompanied with experiences like depression, anxiety, lack of self trust, self doubt, self criticism, inability to maintain healthy relationships, whether it's the fact that we struggle to set boundaries, we struggle to show up for ourselves, or we tend to get into patterns whereby we abandon ourselves. It's not just about looking at these particular issues, it's looking at what's underlying it. And when people come to me and they talk about these issues, I'm struggling with depression, I'm struggling with anxiety, oftentimes people don't say, I have trauma. When we start to understand the root of this issue, that's when we look at people's history, what's happened before that people haven't dealt with. And often this goes back to childhood. I'm not saying everything goes back to childhood, but in most cases, it goes back to childhood. And I think this is why it's really, really important to start to think a little bit more about childhood trauma. That's what we're going to look into today. So, childhood is a period of helplessness and powerlessness because we're completely, um, we have no resources when we're born. We're at the mercy of the people who look after us, and that can be your parents, your carers, whoever that is, the community. But you have no resources, and you have to depend on the people looking after you. And when the people looking after us aren't safe, or they don't have the adequate resources to look after us, that can impact our growth, our development, our sense of safety, how we view ourselves, how we see the world, and how we see other people. So, it's not just childhood trauma is not just about what happened to you, whether it's the fact that you didn't have a safe home, you didn't have a safe adult, whether it's the fact that you were heavily criticized, you were bullied, you experienced racism. It's also what did not happen to you. What were the needs that you have? Because we have non negotiable needs that are like oxygen. Even though we can still breathe, if you have food, if you have water, you have a roof over your head, and this, the absence or like this physical, your physical needs are being met, that does not mean you can't suffer emotionally, that doesn't mean that your development and your growth can't be impacted. So you can have food, you can have water, you can have shelter, you have a roof over your head, you even have people around you. That's not enough. You have other needs like need for safety, need for emotional security, the need to feel seen, the need to be mirrored. Like someone is like, there's an adult, a safe adult there, helping you understand your experiences in the world, helping you understand your emotions, validating you, soothing you, being there when you're not in a good place, when you upset, being able to help you label what you feel, being able to help you regulate. Particularly about regulation is one of the things that I talk to people about a lot, because many people, when they struggle with these issues that I've identified, whether it's low self-worth, low self-esteem, low self-confidence, self-trust issues, many people don't have the ability or the capacity or the skills to self-soothe. They don't have the tools to manage emotions like sadness, emotions like disappointment, emotions like grief, or even tiredness. People don't have these tools, they don't have these skills. And we're not born with this set of skills. We learn them through the way in which we are soothed as children, is how we internalize what self-soothing is. If we haven't been taught, or if we haven't experienced healthy ways of soothing, it becomes difficult as an adult to learn to soothe. That's one of the foundation to an identity crisis. That's one of the foundation to being disconnected from who we are. When we struggle to manage our emotions or to identify with our emotions, then it's really, really difficult for us to connect with ourselves, because emotion form a really huge part and parcel of who we are. They're not who we are, but they're signals in telling us in how we interact with ourselves, the world around us, and other people around us. So when our needs for emotional safety isn't met in childhood, it becomes really, really difficult for us to navigate a lot of our adult affairs without unpacking and what we call in therapy reparenting, or re-establishing a relationship with your inner child. So we can't talk about low self-worth, low self-esteem without talking about trauma. And this big myth is that trauma has to be this thing, like, it's just about the event, it's just about the big events that's happened. And it really isn't. And I can share with you some of my own traumatic experiences, or my trauma profile, like I like to put it. And I would say, for me, of course, childhood had good parts and it had bad parts. I had needs as a child that weren't met. And there were needs that were met as well. There were things that were great in childhood, things that, helped me become the person that I am today, which I'm really, really grateful for. And there were also things that, I have had to heal from, or that I am currently healing from. There were things that happened in childhood. And I'm not going to go too much deep into these things, but one of the main things that I went through as a child was a war, actually. Growing up in a little town, it's not little, a town called Ife in Nigeria. Um, there was war. I think I must have been around about 8 or 9, and the war wasn't like it was always an ongoing thing. It happened way before I was born. It's over land, like most wars are over land, territory, and all of that type of stuff. And it displaced a lot of people. It wasn't because of the absence of social media. You may not have heard about it, but it's called the Ife Modakeke crisis. That's what these two sort of kind of neighboring towns or city, as you may want to sort of kind of like describe it. And they fought over land, like my land, your land. This is not your place. And what happened was houses were getting burnt, people were getting killed. They had sort of kind of like a war zone very close to where I lived, right, in fact, right in front of where I lived, gunshots blazing and all of that type of stuff. And I have memories of all of this. And there was a particular night that we had to sleep under the bed, so to avoid stray bullets. And that's one of the things that happened in childhood. Now, that's one traumatic experience. But another traumatic experience for me was bullying, and difficult, like betrayal in friendships, when I was in high school. And when I talk about these two things, in fact, I not talking about these two things, I've had to learn that actually the one thing that came out first in my therapy session was not the war. It was actually the bullying. And when I tell people that I've survived war, they're like, what? Like when I tell my friends, my close friends, not everybody, they're like, how come you never talk about that? Because whilst it was traumatic at the time, it wasn't necessarily something that stayed with me. And the reason why that didn't have a prolonged impact on me was because I was supported through that. In fact, with the war, it brought my family together. I saw my dad in a much more caring role than I'd ever seen him before. Now, a lot of kind of like my childhood trauma also stems from my dad, and I'm not going to go into that today. During the war, I also got to, I got to leave the town and I got to leave school. School was a really, really difficult place for me. An everyday thing where I just sort of, get on with it type attitude. I never spoke to anyone about what was happening, like the relationship issues I was having, the bullying that was going on. I was alone in those experiences. And so those impacted me. They impacted the way in which I trusted or didn't trust people. It impacted how I saw myself. Like I had to always be okay. I can't trust people. Like I have to protect myself from people. I developed a lot of unconscious survival patterns from that particular experience. That was very that showed up a lot in my adult relationships than from the war. When the war happened, I got to leave school. In fact, my life was better. I got to go to another town where my aunties were, and my auntie had a family friend who owned a farm. I got to walk on the farm, like, eat fresh meat, fresh food. It was a period of escapism for me, which was really good for me at the time. And I never really thought about all of these things because in childhood, you just get on with it. So when I compare those two experiences and I ask people, like, you know, people think, wow, you went through war. That must have been really, really difficult. That must have been something that, was really hard for you. And I'm like, it was difficult at the time. And, I will not compare my experience to another person because people lost family members. I didn't lose anybody. Luckily enough, people lost their houses. I didn't lose my house. The way people were supported were different. So, a key indication in how we move on from trauma is not necessarily about the gravity of the event, but really it's about what support was there for you when you were going through this hardship and difficulties. And events become traumatic when we have little to no support, when the pain isn't held, when the pain hasn't been heard, when the pain hasn't been given a voice and it gets taught, and we cope with it with patterns, what we call survivor patterns. And these survivor patterns, they're not necessarily thought through. Now, in therapy, we call them survivor mode, places that we go to protect ourselves from the pain of the experience, the things that our body has to do, whether that be hypervigilance, whether that be shutting down, whether that be going into sort of kind of like people pleasing mode. All of these survivor patterns end up staying with us and can shape the way in which we relate with ourselves, with other people, and with the world around us. So, Trauma is not necessarily just the event alone, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what's happened to you. It's an injury that leaves you feeling powerless and helpless. It's an injury that leaves you going into places of survival mode. And survival mode is they're very clever mode. Whether it's the fact that, like, hypervigilance, your brain constantly alerting you to threat because it has experienced pain, is experienced not feeling safe, and is trying to protect you, or whether it's the fact that your body decides to shut you down because it's overwhelmed. There's so much going on inside that it does not have the resources, the capacity to just produce and show up. And so you go into shut down, into freeze, into sort of like depressive mode, in order for you to sort of kind of like be safe, or whether it's the fact that you have to cut shape, you have to sort of like monitor what other people are doing or what they're thinking and sort of come up with ways to protect yourself, which we call the fun response, like people pleasing response. They are clever adaptation for survival. But the way in which we survive is not the same way in which we are going to stay alive, or is not the same way in which we are going to find fulfillment in our lives. These survival mechanisms, they were never meant to be long-term coping strategies. They were meant to be short-term coping strategies. But when we don't look at the pain, when we don't go back to explore the pain, to meet the pain with what it needs in order to heal. So if you think about trauma as, I broke my arm. Now, if I break my arm, this arm, and I don't get it checked, okay, granted, it's not going to kill me, right? There's something broken there. And I carry on with life like that. Now, this harm can never fulfill its duties and its obligations the same way it would have been sort of performing. I might sort of struggle to write. That can affect me in so many ways, in maybe what I do or what I don't do. It might affect how I show up in my relationship. Maybe people ask me to do something for them and I say I can't do it. And so I start to let people down a lot, but I'm not telling people that I can't help you because I broke my arm. I haven't taken it to get treated or, checked, and I carry on through life. The trauma of this hand is not just the initial injury. It's the subsequent impact. What is it costing me? Is it costing me relationships? Is it costing me work? Is it costing me my sense of self, my sense of identity, the way that I see myself, that I'm not a full person anymore? I'm not an able-bodied anymore. I am not reliable anymore. And this is exactly what happens when we are traumatized, whether it's childhood trauma, whether it's what happened to you, whether you were heavily criticized, or whether you had parents who were, present. There was roof, there was food, but they just didn't make you feel safe. You didn't feel seen. You weren't supported to understand your emotional world. You carried a lot of things alone. You learned to shut down. All of these things has an impact, not explicitly, but it has an impact on the way in which we start to see who we are and in which we start to define who we are. And when we spend so much time, in survival mode, where there is, coping by people pleasing a lot, overworking, overextending ourselves, being quite hypervigilant, it costs us a lot. We never really have time to discover who we are outside of this role. We never really have time to sort of think about our values, what matters to me, because the survival mode, these ways in which we've adapted, they are just so very exhausting. And oftentimes people sort of come to therapy for that because they find that they just are in the loop of feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, overworking, not finding fulfillment, struggling to cope with feelings. And, you never are able to sort of say, well, this is because this happened to me. Because oftentimes what happened is not just one thing, particularly when we're talking about childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is not just a trauma of like, I broke my arm in childhood. when it has a lot to do with how we were met, when it has a lot to do with how we weren't met, when it has a lot to do with our needs that went unmet. And as children and as adults, a lot of us don't even know what we need. In my work as a therapist, I have to go to the ABCs of teaching people these are your needs. You have a need because people would often say, what people would say is, oh, I didn't have a bad childhood. I had a house. I was very lucky. My parents were there, or, I had parents, or I had a big family. I went on nice holiday, this, that, and the other. And so I don't know how I ended up here, how I ended up feeling not so confident. And we're like, okay, that's nice that you had all these things and, you had a roof over your head. You had present parents. One question that I often ask people is, when you would be upset as a child, who did you go to? And this becomes a question that makes people go, upset as a child? No one. Oh, okay. So when you would struggle with something, you had nobody. Well, that's neglect. Because neglect often isn't loud. It's not about an absence of food or an absence of a person. Neglect shows up when your needs are met. As a child, you need people, you need adults who are able to hold your feelings. You need adults that you know that you can go to when you're upset because you're not equipped to deal with that alone. You're a child. You don't have the tools to deal with that alone. So when we don't have those necessity, because it's non-negotiable, it's not a luxury to sort of say that there is someone there helping you learn how to soothe. When you don't have those adults there, and it's not necessarily like, I'm not saying childhood trauma is just a trauma of what happens at home. It could also be what happens outside of the home, like, racism. It could be bullying at school. It could be, not feeling accepted, whether you are sort of, from a marginalized community, and just never experiencing safety in the community. It adds up. And when you don't have people supporting you in carrying these problems and navigating them, it even makes it worse because your brain and your body is going to go at it alone. When our brain perceives danger, it's not the best at dealing with danger. I mean, it's the brain's job is not about sort of thinking about what's going to fulfill you, what's going to make you discover yourself. Its immediate job is safety in the present moment. So if your brain sort of perceives that the world around you isn't safe, it's going to sort of immediately go into action mode, into sort of kind of like getting you to make sure that, you look out for danger. So you might develop sort of sensitivity, hypersensitivity to looking out for danger. How do I make people like me? Let me overgive to people. That way, like, people will like me. Let me shut down parts of myself so that I won't really show this part of myself. Let me clown up. Let me make people laugh. So I become the comedian in the group. And when that happens, what that does is it chips away from your sense of self and from your sense of, from your self-worth. You start to show up in ways in which that's not who you are. And you start to attract people who don't really know you. And you start to learn ways to cope by hiding parts of who you are or all of who you are. And you might not know because you just are surviving. You're showing up, you're alive, you're doing what you need to do, but you are not showing up as who you are. And when you're not showing up as who you are, your body tells that story too. And it's not going to tell the story as in, I did this because of this. It's going to show up in symptoms. It's going to show up in, like being tense all the time. It's going to show up in being exhausted. And what we also know is it's going to show up in like your physical health, whether it's skin issues, autoimmune disease, quite a lot of other physical health problems. Or maybe you cope, you find ways to self-soothe that also create problem. One of the things that people come to me for is, being quite critical of their body image, struggling with food because they self-soothe by eating or by overeating or addictive behaviors. And so we sort of kind of go through life. We have to survive one way or another. And when we don't have the right tools, well, we go to tools that I won't say they are wrong. They are adaptive. They help us cope in the short term, but they don't support us in the long term. And what can happen is when we develop these undesirable coping mechanisms, um, and they create problems of their own, who do we attack? We attack ourselves. We attack who we are. We see ourselves as unworthy. Something is wrong with me. And what does that do? That further chips away at our sense of worth, at our sense of self, at our self esteem, and can have other additional costs, whether that be financial costs, whether that be, occupational costs. If we're not showing up as who we are, if we are not able to maximize our own potential, then it can affect, how we go through life, the opportunities that we seek. One thing that it particularly affects is that we just aren't living life on our own terms. We deviate from our values, from our core values, and we're just here, literally just coping and surviving through life. We're not really connected to the causes or the things that matter to us. And so I hope with all of this, you are able to make some links between traumatic experiences from the past, whether you've identified that there might be things, there might be needs there might be needs in childhood that have not been met, whether it is the fact that you can identify that, like, I'm constantly in this mode of like anxiety, depression, and I've never really thought about why that might be. I hope this is food for thought for you to think about the fact that you aren't what's going on right now, but it's your job to try and identify, why will my body be getting into these places of survival? Why am I coping in these ways? Because these are coping mechanisms. The symptoms are just signs of um, things that we haven't dealt with. They're not who we are. They're just signs. And when we look at them, when we look at the stories that they're telling, we can get to the bottom, the root cause of them, and get to understand ourselves better. So I hope this is great food for thought for you. And this helps you reflect on, what pattern, not pattern, what pain has gone in the past that I haven't really thought about. What are the needs that I had, maybe as a child, maybe growing up, that weren't met? What experiences has impacted the way that I see myself, the way that I see other people, particularly if the way that you see yourself currently does not serve you, then it's really, really important that you ask those questions, because without asking those questions, it becomes really costly. You just aren't showing up in the world as your authentic self. And I believe that, we deserve to not just be here alive, we deserve to live a life that gives us purpose and a life that gives us meaning. And it's never too late to self discover who you are, regardless of where you are on that journey. You can always learn, you can always heal, and you can always grow. I hope you found this episode really useful. And if you do have any questions, please do comment, or you can also reach out to me on my social media channels. And really, I just hope that this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.